From barbarian raiders to the architects of medieval Europe, the Franks transformed from Germanic tribes hurling spears across the Rhine into the builders of Western civilization itself. Over 7 centuries, they evolved from pagan warriors living in wooden halls to Christian emperors ruling from marble palaces, creating the governmental, legal, and cultural foundations that still shape our world today. This is the complete story of how Clovis united the tribes, Charles Martel saved Europe from Islamic conquest, and Charlemagne built an empire that rivaled Rome. Their kingdom gave birth to France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire, while their innovations in law, administration, and military tactics spread across the continent. The Frankish legacy lives on in every European crown, every legal code, and every institution of Western government. The story of the Frankish kingdom begins not with crowns or castles, but with mud and blood along a great river that divided 2 worlds. Long before any Frank would call himself king, before the name of Clovis would echo through history, before Christian bells would ring from Reims to the Rhine, there were only warriors in the mist. Fierce tribes who knew nothing of kingdoms but everything of war. Along the Rhine's muddy banks, where the great river carved its serpentine path between the civilized Roman world and the dark forests of Germania, a confederation of Germanic tribes began to stir with restless energy. The Romans called them Franci, the fierce ones, though the warriors themselves knew their identity through deeds rather than names. In their wooden halls, scattered across the marshy lowlands, chieftains counted bronze arm rings and sharpened iron spears, while imperial watchtowers flickered with warning fires across the water. Each spring, the tribal leaders met under the shelter of ancient oaks, their arguments swelling over stolen herds and disputed borders. These were not the organized legions that marched in perfect formation along stone roads, but something far more dangerous. Free warriors who fought for honor and plunder, bound together by oaths sworn over mead horns and the shared contempt for any man who would bow his neck to another's yoke. Their shields bore no imperial eagles, their standards flew no purple banners, yet their war cries echoed across the frontier with a power that made imperial commanders wake sweating in their beds. When Roman centurions first encountered these fierce peoples in battle, they discovered warriors who fought with a terrifying combination of individual courage and collective fury. The Germanic fighters would lock their shields together in an impenetrable wall, their long spears bristling like the spines of some monstrous beast, while their voices joined in battle songs that seemed to shake the very earth. Behind this shield wall stood men who had never known defeat on their own terms, who viewed death in battle not as catastrophe, but as the highest honor their gods could grant. Through the mist-shrouded valleys of the Rhine's eastern bank, imperial merchants brought tales of these barbarian settlements, clusters of wooden buildings surrounded by earthen ramparts, where smoke rose from forge fires, and the ring of hammers on anvils competed with the lowing of cattle. The warriors lived simply but fiercely, their wealth measured in weapons and livestock rather than coin, their laws spoken rather than written, their justice swift and absolute as the fall of an executioner's axe. Beyond the empire's fortified frontier, the confederation of tribes called themselves by many names. Sali, Bructeri, Chamavi, Chatuari, each claiming descent from legendary ancestors, each maintaining their own customs and dialects. Yet something deeper than mere tribal identity began to unite them during the long winters, when imperial patrols huddled behind their walls and left the frozen river unguarded. They shared stories of successful raids, intermarried between clans, and slowly began to see themselves as part of a greater whole. Roman chronicles record the first major crossing in the year 253, when barbarian war bands poured across the frozen waters like wolves descending on sheep. The warriors came not as conquerors seeking permanent territory, but as raiders hungry for the wealth that civilization had accumulated over centuries. They struck at isolated villas and undefended towns, gathering silver and slaves before vanishing back across the river like smoke dissipating in winter wind. Each spring brought fresh incursions as the tribal confederation grew bolder and more organized. The Germanic fighters learned to time their attacks with the flooding season, when imperial cavalry could not pursue across the swollen waterways. They discovered which settlements held the richest plunder, which roads carried the most valuable merchant traffic, which fortifications had been weakened by neglect or political turmoil within the empire itself. In the forests of Germania, young warriors listened to their elders speak of imperial weakness with growing excitement. Stories spread of cities where gold lay piled in temples, of villas where soft-handed nobles hoarded treasures beyond counting, of a civilization grown fat and slow on its own success. The raids transformed from desperate hunger into calculated opportunity, from random violence into something approaching strategy. By the 4th century, imperial commanders faced a transformed situation along their northern frontier. The confederation of tribes had evolved from scattered raiders into a persistent threat that required constant military attention. Official sources begin to speak not of individual war bands, but of the Franks as a unified force, a people whose very name struck fear into garrison commanders and provincial governors alike. From their wooden halls, Frankish chieftains began to negotiate with imperial officials not as supplicants seeking mercy, but as equals offering services the empire desperately needed. The legions that had once conquered Gaul and Britain were being recalled to defend Italy itself, leaving vast stretches of frontier undermanned and vulnerable. Into this vacuum stepped barbarian auxiliaries, foederati, who agreed to defend imperial territory in exchange for regular payments and the right to settle on imperial soil. The settlement of Frankish families in abandoned villas marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between empire and barbarian. These were no longer raiders, striking quickly and withdrawing, but permanent residents who planted crops, raised children, and built communities on what had once been exclusively imperial ground. The warriors kept their weapons and their tribal loyalties, but they also learned Roman law, adopted imperial agricultural techniques, and began to see the prosperity of their new lands as worth defending. Across the river's freezing waters, more tribes watched these developments with keen interest. The Salian Franks, dwelling in the coastal regions where Rhine met sea, proved particularly adept at this new form of warfare through settlement. They established themselves in what imperial chroniclers called Toxandria, a marshy region that imperial forces had largely abandoned, and from there extended their influence southward into the heart of Gaul. The Ripuarian Franks, taking their name from their position along the river itself, chose a different path. They maintained their traditional territories east of the Rhine, while sending war bands to serve as mercenaries in imperial armies, fighting across the known world. These fighters returned home with weapons forged in imperial workshops, tactical knowledge learned from professional soldiers, and silver that funded further expansion of their tribal confederations. Through generations of contact, conflict, and cooperation, the fierce peoples of the Rhine frontier transformed themselves from scattered raiders into something unprecedented. Barbarian kingdoms that combined Germanic military prowess with Roman administrative knowledge. The warriors who had once known only the wooden halls of their ancestors now ruled from stone cities, commanded armies that mixed tribal levies with professional soldiers, and governed populations that included both Germanic settlers and imperial provincials. When the 5th century dawned with the empire's western half, crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, the Confederation stood ready to inherit the lands they had spent 2 centuries learning to desire. The transformation from raiders to rulers was complete, though few could yet imagine that these tribal confederations would evolve into kingdoms that would define European civilization for centuries to come. Out of the haze of tribal legend stepped a man whose name would ring across the centuries. Childeric I, king of the Salian Franks, whose golden bees and crystal sphere would lie in his grave for more than a millennium before French kings claimed them as emblems of their sacred power. The legendary monarch ruled not from marble halls, but from wooden fortresses along the Somme, where smoke rose from forge fires, and the ring of bronze on anvil competed with the lowing of cattle in morning fog. The Merovingians traced their bloodline to Merovic, a semi-mythical king whose very existence blurred the line between history and legend. Frankish bards claimed he was born of 2 fathers, one mortal, one a sea monster from beyond the Rhine's mouth, granting his descendants supernatural strength and the divine right to rule. Whether truth or invention, this origin story served its purpose, legitimizing a dynasty that would transform barbarian warbands into the foundation of medieval kingship. His authority rested on him like a bronze-studded leather cloak, built for use, not for show. Unlike imperial emperors who surrounded themselves with purple silk and golden diadems, the Frankish ruler led from the front ranks of battle, his long iron sword drinking enemy blood, while his voice boomed commands across muddy battlefields. His hall welcomed both Germanic chieftains and Roman officials with equal honor, mead horns passing freely between men who had been enemies the previous season. In the middle years of the 5th century, as Roman power crumbled like a wall built without mortar, Childeric found himself serving 2 masters with remarkable success. Imperial commanders still held theoretical authority over Gaul, their legions maintaining garrisons in major cities, their taxes still flowing eastward to support distant wars. Yet the reality on the ground spoke differently. Barbarian warbands controlled vast swaths of countryside, while Roman officials increasingly depended on Germanic allies to maintain even the illusion of imperial control. The warrior king proved himself invaluable to both sides through a series of campaigns that demonstrated his tactical genius and political cunning. When Saxon raiders threatened the Loire Valley, Childeric's Franks joined imperial legions to force the invaders back to their ships. His warriors fought with their traditional ferocity, shield walls bristling with iron spears, while Roman cavalry provided mobility and discipline the tribal forces sometimes lacked. Military service under Rome brought the Merovingians more than just silver and plunder. It provided access to imperial administrative knowledge that would prove invaluable in ruling settled populations. Childeric learned to read Latin dispatches, understand Roman law, and navigate the complex web of alliances and obligations that held the empire together. These skills transformed him from a mere war chief into something approaching a true statesman. Between campaigns, conflicts with neighboring tribes tested the king's ability to maintain Frankish unity while expanding his territorial control. The Alemanni pressed from the east, their own confederation seeking Lebensraum in territories the Franks considered their ancestral right. Bloody battles fought in autumn mud determined which villages would pay tribute to whom, which trade routes would remain open, which chieftains would bend the knee or feed the ravens. Childeric's diplomatic marriages wove a complex web of alliances that strengthened Frankish power throughout northern Gaul. His own queen, Basina, had fled to his court from the kingdom of the Thuringians, bringing with her valuable intelligence about Germanic politics east of the Rhine. Their union represented more than romantic attraction. It symbolized the growing confidence of barbarian rulers, who no longer sought merely Roman approval, but actively pursued independent diplomatic relationships. During these turbulent decades, the political vacuum left by collapsing imperial authority in Gaul created opportunities that ambitious leaders could exploit with sufficient skill and ruthlessness. Provincial governors found themselves commanding phantom legions, their orders carrying weight only within city walls, their treasury empty of the gold needed to maintain professional armies. Into this chaos stepped men like the Frankish king, offering military strength in exchange for recognition and territory. The discovery of the ruler's tomb in 1653 revealed treasures that illuminated both his wealth and his sophisticated understanding of royal symbolism. Golden bees adorned his burial robes, insects that represented immortality and resurrection in both Germanic and Mediterranean traditions. A crystal ball rested beside his weapons, suggesting either magical practices or diplomatic gifts from distant lands. These artifacts spoke of a ruler who combined traditional barbarian values with cosmopolitan influences, absorbed through contact with the wider world. From his fortress at Tournai, the king commanded loyalty that extended far beyond blood relationships or tribal obligations. His warband included not only Frankish nobles, but also Roman refugees, Saxon mercenaries, and ambitious young men from a dozen different tribes, who saw service under the Merovingians as a path to wealth and glory. This diverse following presaged the multi-ethnic character that would define the Frankish kingdoms for centuries to come. As the 470s passed into history, the aging monarch began preparing his son for the responsibilities of kingship that would soon fall upon younger shoulders. Clovis learned statecraft at his father's side, participating in diplomatic negotiations, leading small war bands against cattle raiders, and absorbing the delicate balance of force and persuasion that successful rule required. The young prince showed promise in both traditional Germanic warfare and the more subtle arts of imperial administration. In shaping the succession, the ruler recognized that the realm his son would govern was not the same as the one he had inherited. Where tribal custom and imperial law had once coexisted uneasily, future kings would need to forge entirely new systems of governance. The challenge facing the next generation would be immense: how to maintain Germanic warrior traditions while governing Romanized populations, how to command tribal loyalty while respecting settled law, how to expand territory without destroying the civilization they sought to inherit. Throughout his reign, Childeric had observed the steady erosion of imperial institutions that had once seemed eternal. Tax collectors no longer appeared with regular frequency, military conscription had become a memory, and the elaborate bureaucracy that had administered Gaul for 4 centuries existed now mainly on parchment. Yet the infrastructure of civilization remained. Roads still carried merchants and messengers, cities still housed craftsmen and scholars, and the Latin language still served as the medium of educated discourse. The Merovingians stood poised between 2 eras, the dying age of imperial authority and the birth of something unprecedented in European history. When the great king died in 481, his funeral combined Germanic warrior traditions with ceremonial elements borrowed from imperial practice. The king's weapons were buried beside him: his great iron sword, his bronze-headed spears, his silver-mounted shield, ensuring he would be properly armed for whatever battles awaited in the afterlife. Horses were sacrificed at the burial mound, their spirits intended to carry their master across the bridge between worlds. Yet Christian symbols also appeared among the grave goods, reflecting the religious complexity of a realm where pagan customs coexisted with the new faith spreading from the Mediterranean. The emergence of Clovis as his father's heir marked not merely a dynastic transition, but the beginning of Frankish expansion that would reshape the political map of Western Europe. At 15 years of age, the young warrior already showed the mixture of Germanic ferocity and Roman sophistication that had made his father successful. He could speak Latin as fluently as his native Frankish tongue, understood both tribal law and imperial legal codes, and possessed the military instincts that would soon make him the terror of his enemies and the hope of his people. At 15, the young king stood over his father's fresh grave and made a promise that would drench Gaul in blood for 30 years. His first act was not to mourn, but to sharpen his sword, a blade that would taste the life of every rival who dared challenge the supremacy of his people. While other barbarian princes squabbled over cattle and tribute, this teenage warlord dreamed of something far grander, an empire built on the bones of Rome itself. The boy king's first target wasn't some distant enemy, but the man who controlled the richest prize in Gaul, Syagrius, the last Roman general still pretending the Western Empire hadn't collapsed. From his stronghold at Soissons, this so-called king of the Romans collected taxes, minted coins, and maintained the fiction that imperial authority meant something, in a world where barbarian steel had become the only law that mattered. Syagrius commanded professional legions trained in the classical manner, with disciplined ranks and siege engines that had once conquered the known world. His treasury overflowed with gold accumulated through decades of taxation. His diplomats spoke the language of civilization to courts across the Mediterranean. Yet for all his advantages, the general faced a fundamental problem. He was fighting yesterday's war against tomorrow's king. Clovis struck in 486 with the fury of a summer storm, his warriors pouring across the Somme like wolves descending on sheep. He had learned his father's lessons well. This wasn't merely conquest, but calculated theatre, designed to announce to every barbarian tribe in Gaul that a new power had risen to challenge the old order. The Battle of Soissons would be remembered not for its tactical brilliance, but for its psychological impact. The clash itself unfolded with brutal efficiency. Imperial formations, perfected through centuries of warfare, met Germanic fury that recognized no rules save victory or death. Syagrius watched his disciplined legions crumble before warriors who fought like demons possessed, their battle cries echoing across the field as bronze met iron in sprays of crimson. When the dust settled, the last vestige of imperial power in northern Gaul lay bleeding in the mud, but victory brought an unexpected complication that would haunt the king for years. Among the spoils captured from Soissons was a magnificent silver bowl claimed by one of his warriors according to ancient Germanic custom. When Bishop Remigius of Reims requested its return, the vessel belonged to his church. The young conqueror faced his first test of royal authority versus tribal tradition. The warrior who held the bowl sneered at his lord's request and smashed the precious artifact with his battle axe. The insult burned in the royal heart like poison, but the king merely smiled and said nothing. A year later, during the annual review of his army, he recognized the same warrior among his troops. "Your weapons are poorly maintained," he observed mildly, seizing the man's axe and hurling it to the ground. As the warrior bent to retrieve it, his lord split his skull with a single blow. "Thus," he declared to the silent ranks, "did you treat the bowl at Soissons." Marriage came next, but this was no romantic liaison. It was the cold calculation of a conqueror who understood that diplomacy could achieve what swords sometimes could not. Clotilde, Princess of the Burgundians, brought more than beauty to court. She carried with her the Catholic faith that would reshape European civilization. Her uncle Gundobad had murdered her parents and siblings, leaving her the sole survivor of a royal bloodline that commanded loyalty throughout Eastern Gaul. The wedding feast at Soissons glittered with Germanic gold and imperial silver, barbarian chieftains sharing mead horns with Catholic bishops, while Clotilde's dowry negotiations secured military alliances that would prove crucial in wars to come. Yet beneath the celebration lay tension that every guest could feel. The new queen served a god who demanded exclusive worship, while her husband honored the ancient Germanic deities who had granted his ancestors victory in countless battles. Within months of their marriage, the royal couple's first child arrived. But joy turned to anguish when Clotilde demanded Christian baptism for the infant. Her husband's warriors muttered darkly about foreign gods, while tribal elders insisted the boy be dedicated to Wotan and Thor in the ancient manner. When the child died shortly after his baptism, pagan voices whispered that the alien deity had proven weaker than Germanic steel. A second son survived his Christian initiation, but theological arguments raged through the royal court like wildfire. The Alemanni provided the king with the perfect opportunity to test both his military strength and divine favor. This fierce confederation had terrorized the Rhine frontier for generations, their warriors renowned for a savagery that impressed even other Germanic tribes. When they invaded his territory in 496, he faced enemies who matched his own people in courage, but surpassed them in desperation. Defeated Alemanni warriors would become slaves or corpses, with no middle ground. At Tolbiac, near modern Cologne, two armies met in a battle that would determine the religious future of Western Europe. The Alemanni charged like maddened bears, their wedge formation punching deep into tribal ranks while their war cries shook the very earth. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain, bodies piling in bloody heaps as neither side could gain decisive advantage. Germanic fought Germanic, with the peculiar hatred reserved for brothers who have chosen different paths. Then, as defeat seemed imminent and his warriors began to waver, the young conqueror made the bargain that would echo through history. Raising his eyes to heaven, he cried out not to his ancestral gods, but to the deity his wife served, Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde declares to be the Son of the living God. If you grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and be baptized in your name. The prayer was less conversion than desperate negotiation, a warrior's contract with whatever power might prove strongest. Victory came with shocking suddenness. The Alemanni king fell beneath a spear, and his leaderless warriors scattered like leaves before winter wind. Survivors fled eastward beyond the Rhine, abandoning territories their ancestors had held for 2 centuries. The triumph was so complete, so unexpected, that even pagan warriors began to whisper that perhaps their young lord had discovered something more powerful than traditional magic. Baptism followed in the Cathedral of Reims on Christmas Day, 496, with Bishop Remigius performing the ceremony that would transform European history. As the teenage conqueror descended into the sacred waters, 3,000 of his warriors followed their lord into the new faith. The Germanic gods who had blessed tribal swords for centuries were abandoned in a single morning, replaced by a deity who promised not merely victory, but eternal life. Yet the king's conversion proved as calculating as his conquests. Catholic Christianity commanded the loyalty of populations throughout Gaul, peoples who had viewed Aryan barbarian rulers as heretical oppressors. By embracing Orthodox faith, The conqueror positioned himself as the natural protector of these subjects, transforming potential rebels into enthusiastic supporters. The political genius of this move would become apparent in campaigns to come. The Visigoths controlled most of southern Gaul from their capital at Toulouse, their Arian Christianity marking them as enemies of both Catholic populations and the newly converted Frankish king. These descendants of the warriors who had sacked Rome possessed vast territories, professional armies, and diplomatic connections spanning the Mediterranean. Their king, Alaric II, commanded respect from Constantinople to Ravenna, his court a center of Gothic culture and Arian theology. But Visigothic strength concealed fatal weaknesses that Clovis had already identified. Their Arian faith alienated Catholic subjects, while their Germanic ruling class remained isolated from Romance-speaking populations. Most critically, their military traditions emphasized individual heroism over coordinated tactics, a flaw the Frankish king intended to exploit with ruthless efficiency. The campaign of 507 unfolded like a masterpiece of strategic planning. While Visigothic armies concentrated against expected threats from the north, Clovis struck from unexpected directions, his mounted warriors covering impossible distances to appear where enemies least expected them. City after city opened its gates to the Catholic liberator, local bishops blessing banners that bore both Christian crosses and Germanic wolf heads. At Vouillé, near Poitiers, Alaric II made his final stand with the flower of Visigothic nobility arrayed in glittering armor forged in Spanish workshops. The Gothic king fought with ancient courage, his personal combat skills legendary even among enemies. Yet individual prowess meant nothing against coordinated assault tactics that had evolved far beyond traditional Germanic warfare. The battle ended when the conqueror personally killed Alaric in single combat, his spear punching through royal armor to pierce the Gothic heart. Leaderless Visigothic resistance collapsed overnight, their surviving nobles fleeing southward into Spain, while their abandoned subjects welcomed new rule with joy reserved for divine deliverance. The victory made him master of Gaul from the Channel to the Pyrenees. 30 years of conquest had transformed a teenage tribal king into the founder of medieval kingship itself. The realm he bequeathed to his sons stretched from the Rhine to the Atlantic, encompassing peoples who spoke a dozen languages and followed traditions spanning centuries. Germanic warriors served alongside administrators from the Old Empire. Catholic bishops blessed pagan festivals, and barbaric customs merged with civilized law to create something entirely new in European experience. When the great king died in 511, his funeral combined Christian ritual with Germanic pageantry in ceremonies that symbolized the cultural fusion he had achieved. The crown that passed to his heirs carried with it not merely territorial authority, but the revolutionary concept that barbarian strength and imperial civilization could unite under Christian guidance to forge empires greater than either tradition alone might create. The great king's death in 511 shattered his empire like a clay pot dropped on stone. 4 sons gathered around their father's deathbed, each believing himself worthy of the entire inheritance, none willing to serve under another's authority. Within hours of the funeral, the realm that Clovis had spent 30 years forging was carved into bloody pieces by men who shared his blood, but not his vision. Clodomir received Orléans and the Loire Valley, rich lands that controlled the trade routes between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. Childebert took Paris and the surrounding territories, positioning himself at the heart of what had once been Roman Gaul. Clothar claimed Soissons and the northeastern regions, where their father had first tasted victory. But it was Theuderic, eldest and most ambitious, who seized the prize that mattered most: Reims and the Eastern Marches, where Germanic tradition still burned strongest and warriors still dreamed of conquest beyond the Rhine. The partition should have brought peace through clear boundaries and separate spheres of influence. Instead, it unleashed 50 years of fraternal warfare that would drench the kingdom in blood and reduce entire regions to smoking wasteland. Each brother believed himself the rightful heir to their father's legacy. Each commanded armies loyal unto death, and each possessed the ruthless ambition that had made their dynasty legendary. War erupted first over the Burgundian succession, where King Sigismund had murdered his own son in a fit of rage that shocked even hardened barbarian warriors. The crime provided perfect justification for intervention, though the brothers' true motives had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with seizing Burgundy's legendary wealth. Their armies converged on Geneva like vultures descending on carrion, each hoping to claim the largest portion of the feast. Clodomir led the initial assault, his warriors pouring through alpine passes with the fury of men who had tasted easy victory against divided enemies. Sigismund's forces crumbled before the onslaught, their king fleeing to a monastery where he hoped divine sanctuary might protect him from earthly vengeance. The hope proved futile. Captured within days, the Burgundian monarch was hurled into a well, along with his wife and children, their screams echoing from the depths until silence finally claimed them. But triumph turned to catastrophe when the surviving Burgundians rallied under Godemar, Sigismund's brother, a warrior whose hatred burned hotter than forge fires. At Vézérance, the tide of battle turned with shocking suddenness, as Godemar's desperate troops fought with the fury of men defending their last hope. Clodomir fell beneath a Burgundian blade, his golden hair severed as a trophy, while his leaderless army dissolved into panicked flight. The dead king's orphaned sons became pawns in a game more vicious than any foreign war. Clothar and Childebert, the surviving brothers, invited their young nephews to court with promises of affection and proper care. The children arrived dressed in their finest clothes, innocent of the trap that awaited them. When servants produced a sword and scissors, asking whether the boys should die or become monks, their grandmother, Queen Clotilde, made the choice that sealed their fate. Better dead than shorn. The massacre that followed shocked even an age accustomed to barbaric violence. 2 of the children died beneath their uncle's blades, their royal blood spattering marble floors as servants watched in horrified silence. Only the youngest escaped, spirited away by loyal retainers who risked everything to save their murdered lord's heir. The boy who survived would remember this lesson in family loyalty, carrying hatred in his heart like poison that would eventually destroy them all. Meanwhile, distant campaigns against the Visigoths and Saxons provided outlets for royal ambitions that domestic warfare could not fully satisfy. Childebert's armies crossed the Pyrenees to support a Visigothic pretender, their siege engines battering the walls of Saragossa, while Spanish gold flowed northward to fund further adventures. The campaign ended in negotiated withdrawal rather than conquest, but the wealth captured enriched the kingdom for generations. Saxon incursions across the northern frontier demanded constant military attention, their hit-and-run tactics perfectly suited to the marshy lowlands where heavy cavalry struggled and disciplined infantry formations became death traps. Clothar's response combined traditional Germanic warfare with innovations learned from imperial military manuals, fortified camps, coordinated logistics, and systematic devastation that turned entire regions into uninhabitable wilderness. The Thuringians provided the most challenging enemy, their kingdoms stretching across vast territories that controlled vital trade routes between the Baltic and the Mediterranean. These descendants of ancient Germanic tribes had built a confederation that rivaled the Franks in military strength, while surpassing them in diplomatic sophistication. Their cities glittered with Byzantine gold and Saxon amber. Their courts welcomed merchants and scholars from across the known world. Yet Thuringian prosperity concealed the same weakness that had doomed the Burgundians, internal divisions that ambitious enemies could exploit with sufficient cunning and ruthlessness. Theudoric's agents spent years cultivating dissent among tribal chieftains, promising rewards to those who would betray their king while threatening destruction for those who remained loyal. When the hammer finally fell, resistance crumbled as swiftly as morning mist. The decisive campaign unfolded with clockwork precision. While Thuringian armies concentrated against expected attacks from the west, eastern forces struck through supposedly impassable mountain passes, so their guides provided by local chieftains who had been secretly bought with bags of silver coins. King Herminifred found himself surrounded by enemies on all sides, his capital city already in flames before he understood the scope of his betrayal. Personal combat between the rival kings ended the war in appropriately dramatic fashion. Herminifred challenged Theuderic to single combat on a bridge spanning a deep gorge, confident that individual prowess would triumph over political treachery. The fight raged for hours, as thousands watched from both sides, sword ringing against sword, while the combatants circled each other like wolves seeking advantage. Victory came through simple brutality rather than martial skill. As Herminifred raised his blade for what should have been the killing blow, Theuderic's hidden dagger found the gap beneath his enemy's arm, piercing lung and heart with surgical precision. The Thuringian king toppled from the bridge into the rushing waters below, his body swept away by currents that would carry it to seas unknown. With their leader dead, Thuringian resistance collapsed like a house built on sand. The influence of royal women in these succession struggles often proved decisive in ways that traditional military histories overlooked. Queen Brunhild of Austrasia and Queen Fredegund of Neustria transformed dynastic politics into personal vendettas that outlasted their husbands and consumed their children. These women commanded networks of spies and assassins that reached across Europe, their hatred for each other surpassing even the legendary feuds of Germanic mythology. Brunhild arrived from Visigothic Spain as a political marriage designed to cement peace between former enemies. Beautiful, educated, and ruthlessly intelligent, she possessed all the qualities that barbarian warriors claimed to despise in women, while secretly fearing their power. Her conversion from Arian to Catholic Christianity was purely pragmatic, a calculated gesture designed to win popular support among her new subjects. Fredegund rose from humble origins through a combination of sexual allure and murderous ambition that impressed even hardened courtiers. As a servant in the royal household, she caught King Chilperic's eye and systematically eliminated every rival who stood between her and the throne. Wives died in mysterious accidents, concubines succumbed to sudden illnesses, and noble daughters found themselves exiled to remote convents where silence was enforced by armed guards. The blood feud between these queens began over protocol and precedence, but escalated into warfare that consumed kingdoms. When Brunhild's sister was murdered, almost certainly on Fredegund's orders, the Visigothic princess swore oaths of vengeance that would echo through generations. Their children would inherit this hatred along with their crowns, transforming personal animosity into dynastic policy that shaped the kingdom's destiny. By 561, the realm that Clovis had united lay fragmented into competing territories, whose rulers spent more energy fighting each other than expanding their dominion. Yet this apparent weakness concealed underlying strength. The constant warfare had forged military traditions that would prove invaluable in future conflicts, while the competition between courts had accelerated cultural and economic development. in ways that peaceful unity might never have achieved. The death of Clothar I in that year brought temporary reunification under a single crown, but the precedent of division had been established. Future generations would view partition not as failure, but as natural law, creating a pattern of fragmentation and reunion that would define medieval kingship for centuries to come. The sons of Clovis had learned to rule through violence, and their descendants would inherit both the kingdom and the curse. The last surviving son of Clovis stood victorious over his brothers' graves in 561, master of an empire that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Clothar had outlived, outfought, and outmaneuvered every rival who shared his royal blood, reuniting the realm through a combination of military brilliance and patient ruthlessness that would have made his father proud. Yet even as he savored his triumph, the old king knew that unity was an illusion. His own sons were already sharpening their knives. Within months of reunification, the kingdom fractured again, along lines that would define European politics for generations. Austrasia emerged in the east, its capital at Metz commanding the vital Rhine frontier, where Germanic tradition still burned strongest. Neustria consolidated power in the west from its seat at Soissons, controlling the heartland of what had once been Roman Gaul. Burgundy maintained its ancient boundaries around Lyon, while Aquitaine stretched southward toward the Pyrenees, each region developing its own identity and interests. The division reflected more than mere political convenience. It embodied fundamental cultural differences that made lasting unity impossible. Austrasian nobles spoke Germanic dialects, followed tribal law, and dreamed of conquest beyond the Rhine. Neustrian aristocrats preferred Latin, practiced Roman customs, and focused their ambitions on Mediterranean trade. These weren't merely administrative districts, but emerging nations, each convinced of its own superiority. Sigebert I took Austrasia and immediately began planning campaigns that would restore his grandfather's conquests. His marriage to Brunhild, daughter of the Visigothic king Athanagild, brought Spanish gold and Byzantine connections to a court that glittered with Germanic splendor. The new queen arrived with a retinue that included scholars, artists, and diplomats who transformed Metz into a center of learning that rivaled Constantinople itself. Brunhild possessed beauty that could stop conversations and intelligence that could reshape kingdoms. Raised in the sophisticated court of Toledo, she spoke 5 languages fluently, understood theology and philosophy, and could negotiate trade agreements that would have challenged seasoned diplomats. Yet beneath her cultured exterior burned ambitions that would make strong men tremble. She intended to rule not merely as queen, but as the power behind every throne her bloodline might claim. Chilperic claimed Neustria and promptly declared war on civilization itself. Where his brother collected manuscripts and patronized poets, this king preferred gladiatorial games and public executions. His court at Soissons became a byword for excess, where noble guests might find themselves fighting wild beasts for the royal entertainment, or fleeing assassins hired by rival factions seeking favor. The contrast between royal brothers extended to their choice of wives, a decision that would drench the realm in blood for decades. While Sigebert had married Visigothic nobility, Chilperic chose Fredegund, a former servant whose rise to power represented everything the established aristocracy feared and despised. Beautiful, ruthless, and utterly without scruples, she transformed the Neustrian court into a nest of vipers where survival required constant vigilance. Fredegund's background as a slave had taught her lessons that royal birth could never provide. She understood that power belonged to whoever was willing to pay its price in blood, that loyalty could be bought with gold or terror, and that enemies were best eliminated before they realized they were threats. Her network of spies and assassins extended across the kingdom, feeding her information that she used with surgical precision to destroy anyone who opposed her rise. The blood feud between Brunhild and Fredegund began with the murder of Galswintha, Sigebert's sister-in-law, in 568. The Visigothic princess had come to Neustria as Chilperic's bride, bringing vast dowries and diplomatic connections that promised to strengthen ties between the kingdoms. Her death, strangled in her bed on what was almost certainly Fredegund's orders, shattered any hope of peaceful coexistence between the royal courts. Sigebert's response demonstrated that Austrasian nobles had lost none of their grandfather's taste for vengeance. His armies swept into Neustria like avenging angels, their battle cries echoing the ancient war songs that had once terrified Roman legions. Cities opened their gates rather than face siege, while Chilperic's supporters melted away like snow before spring sunlight. The war seemed won before it had properly begun, but Fredegund proved more dangerous wounded than healthy, her desperation driving her to expedients that shocked even hardened warriors. While armies clashed on muddy battlefields, her assassins struck in darkness, targeting not only enemy commanders, but their families, servants, and allies. Poison appeared in wine cups, daggers found hearts in crowded markets, and accidents befell those who had never made enemies. The climax came at the siege of Paris, where Sigebert had cornered his brother's forces and seemed poised for final victory. Chilperic cowered behind the city walls, while Austrasian engines battered the gates and scaling ladders rose against ancient stones. Then, in a moment that changed European history, two of Fredegund's agents approached the victorious king with scramasaxes hidden beneath their cloaks. The assassination of Sigebert in 575 removed the one leader capable of uniting the Eastern kingdoms under strong central authority. His death plunged Austrasia into chaos, as nobles fought over the regency for his young son, while Brunhild found herself struggling to maintain power against enemies who viewed her foreign birth as an excuse for rebellion. The moment of Merovingian triumph collapsed into decades of civil war. Fredegund's victory celebration proved premature when her own husband fell to an assassin's blade 9 years later. Chilperic died at his hunting lodge in 584, struck down by unknown killers who might have served any of a dozen enemies he had accumulated through years of tyrannical rule. His death left Neustria as fractured as Austrasia, with competing claimants and rival factions tearing the kingdom apart from within. The assassination of Chilperic in 584 marked not only the end of a reign, but the beginning of Neustria's darkest period. The dead king's infant son became a pawn in struggles between nobles who cared nothing for royal blood and everything for personal advancement. Fredegund herself barely escaped with her life, fleeing to sanctuary in a cathedral where even her enemies dared not pursue her. Yet the chaos that followed these murders also demonstrated the underlying strength of Merovingian institutions. Despite constant warfare, trade continued to flow along ancient routes. Cities maintained their walls and markets, and the Christian church expanded its influence throughout the realm. The kingdom had learned to function despite dysfunctional leadership, developing administrative mechanisms that could survive even the worst royal excesses. The involvement in Lombard politics reflected the dynasty's growing international ambitions, as Merovingian armies crossed the Alps to support various claimants to the Italian throne. These campaigns brought vast wealth northward, while establishing diplomatic connections that would prove valuable in future conflicts. Burgundian nobles returned from Italian expeditions with Byzantine silk, Roman manuscripts, and tales of cities whose wealth surpassed even their wildest imagination. Byzantine diplomatic overtures during this period recognized the Merovingians as legitimate successors to Roman authority in the West, a development that carried enormous prestige, even as it created new obligations. Imperial embassies arrived bearing gifts of silk and gold, while seeking military assistance against Persian invasions and Avar raids. The barbarian kingdoms had become partners in preserving Mediterranean civilization. The rise of distinct regional identities during this period would prove more lasting than any particular royal dynasty. Austrasian nobles developed military traditions that emphasized heavy cavalry and fortified positions, innovations that would eventually revolutionize European warfare. Neustrian merchants pioneered new trade routes that connected Atlantic ports with Mediterranean markets, creating commercial networks that survived political upheaval. The cultural flowering of this era reflected the kingdom's growing confidence and sophistication. Poets composed epic verses celebrating royal deeds, while craftsmen produced jewelry and weapons that combined Germanic symbolism with Roman techniques. Churches rose in every major city, their architecture blending traditional barbarian elements with classical proportions in styles that would influence medieval art for centuries. Yet beneath the cultural achievement lay foundations built on violence and treachery that would eventually destroy everything the dynasty had created. The blood feuds initiated during this period would consume the next generation, while the precedent of assassination as a political tool would poison royal courts for decades to come. The Merovingian high point contained within itself the seeds of inevitable decline. As the 580s drew to a close, the realm that had once been Clovis's united kingdom existed only as a memory cherished by poets and mourned by chroniclers. The future belonged not to warrior kings who ruled through personal charisma, but to mayors of the palace who understood that true power lay in controlling the machinery of government rather than wearing its ceremonial trappings. Blood pooled beneath the throne as another Merovingian prince breathed his last. The victim of poison slipped into his wine by servants who had once sworn loyalty unto death. The hall at Soissons, where Clovis had once held court with the dignity of a conquering hero, now reeked of fear and betrayal, as nobles whispered behind tapestries and guards wondered if their next paymaster might demand their current master's head. The assassination industry reached full flower during these twilight decades of the dynasty, transforming courts into slaughterhouses where survival required more cunning than courage. Fredegund's network of killers had shown the way, proving that a well-placed dagger could accomplish what armies could not. Soon, every ambitious noble maintained his own stable of murderers, while kings slept with swords beneath their pillows and tasted every meal with growing dread. Clothar II emerged from this carnage as the least likely survivor, a sickly child who inherited Neustria when stronger men had fallen to poison, steel, and treachery. His early reign seemed destined for swift termination. Rival claimants controlled vast territories. Veteran commanders dismissed him as a weakling, and foreign enemies sensed opportunity in Neustrian chaos. Yet the boy possessed something his predecessors had lacked: the wisdom to recognize his own limitations. The young king's survival strategy centered on empowering others to act in his name, while carefully concealing the extent of his own weakness. Mayors of the palace, originally household administrators responsible for managing estates, found their duties expanding to include military command, diplomatic negotiations, and judicial decisions. What began as temporary expedients hardened into permanent arrangement as these officials proved more competent than their masters. Brunhild's final gambit for supreme power demonstrated both the heights of Merovingian ambition and the depths to which monarchical authority had fallen. The aging Visigothic queen had survived decades of court intrigue, outlasted multiple husbands, and accumulated influence that stretched from Spain to the Rhine. Her attempt to rule through her great-grandson, Sigebert II, represented the last serious effort to restore centralized monarchy in the traditional sense. Once admired by the Austrasian nobility for her intelligence and political acumen, the foreign queen was now regarded as standing in the way of their advancement. Whispers spread through the court that she practiced witchcraft, that her unnaturally long life proved demonic assistance, that her influence over the young king threatened Germanic tradition itself. These rumors provided convenient justification for what was essentially a power grab by men who had grown tired of taking orders from a woman. The rebellion that destroyed Brunhild's power base erupted simultaneously across multiple regions, coordinated with precision that revealed extensive planning and communication between conspirators. Cities declared independence from royal authority, garrison commanders switched allegiances overnight, and treasury officials disappeared with strong boxes full of gold. The coup succeeded because it addressed genuine grievances while offering attractive alternatives to royal misrule. Pepin of Landen emerged as the rebellion's most effective leader, his position as mayor of the palace in Austrasia providing both legitimacy and practical power over the kingdom's administrative machinery. Unlike the Merovingians, who relied on personal charisma and ancient bloodlines, this new breed of leader understood that authority flowed from competent governance rather than hereditary claims. The future belonged to administrators, not warriors. The capture and execution of Brunhild in 613 marked the end of an era in Merovingian politics. The once powerful queen died horribly, torn apart by wild horses in a spectacle designed to demonstrate that even ancient bloodlines could not protect those who defied the new order. Her death sent unmistakable messages to surviving royalty: adapt to diminished circumstances or face similar fates. Dagobert I represented the dynasty's last attempt to rule rather than merely reign. His early years marked by military campaigns that recalled the glory days of Clovis and his sons. The young king personally led armies against Saxon raiders, his sword drinking enemy blood while his voice boomed commands across muddy battlefields. Victory followed victory as enemies learned to fear Merovingian steel, wielded by a monarch who understood both strategy and tactics. Even at the height of Dagobert's achievements, it was evident that monarchical power relied entirely on his abilities, not on the strength of the throne itself. When the monarch proved capable, the kingdom functioned effectively. When he showed weakness or preoccupation, chaos erupted as nobles pursued private feuds and regional interests. The realm had become too large and complex for purely personal rule. The king's establishment of Saint-Denis as the burial site represented more than architectural patronage. It embodied his vision of monarchy as sacred institution, blessed by divine authority. The monastery's relics, its golden altarpieces, and its carefully preserved tombs proclaimed continuity with a glorious past while promising eternal stability for the dynasty. Future kings would be buried here, regardless of where they had actually ruled. Dagobert's court attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the known world, creating a cultural renaissance that masked underlying political decay. Poets composed verses celebrating achievements, while craftsmen produced treasures that combined Germanic symbolism with Mediterranean sophistication. The facade of imperial grandeur concealed the reality that power had already shifted to men who controlled administrative machinery rather than ceremonial pageantry. The do-nothing kings, who succeeded Dagobert after his death in 639, became symbols of Merovingian decline, their nicknames reflecting contemporary contempt for rulers who had abandoned even the pretense of active governance. These monarchs might possess ancient bloodlines, and sacred regalia. But their mayors made the decisions that actually mattered: military appointments, tax collection, judicial rulings, and diplomatic negotiations. So gradual was the transformation that its meaning escaped notice until it had passed the point of return. Charters still bore Merovingian names and seals. Ceremonies maintained traditional protocols, and legal documents acknowledged ancient claims. Yet real power had migrated to men who understood that effective government required professional competence rather than hereditary legitimacy. Despite the turbulence of politics, commerce prospered, with merchants turning to mayors rather than monarchs for rights and safety from bandits. The administrative systems developed by these officials proved more reliable than monarchical promises, their practical approach to governance creating conditions that encouraged economic growth throughout the realm. In this period, military advances revealed that mayors valued effectiveness more than custom. Heavy cavalry became increasingly important as commanders recognized its advantages in European warfare, while fortified positions replaced mobile tactics favored by earlier generations. These changes required sustained investment and professional training that hereditary warrior kings often could not provide. The rise of the Arnulfing family in Austrasia demonstrated how patient accumulation of administrative power could surpass dramatic military conquests in long-term significance. Pepin of Landen's descendants understood that controlling key positions in administration was more valuable than seeking the crown itself, at least for now. Their time would come when the dynasty's weakness became so obvious that even legitimist sentiment could no longer sustain it. As central rule faded, local nobles assumed greater authority, reinforcing regional distinctiveness. Aquitanian dukes, Bavarian princes, and Alemannian chieftains governed their territories with increasing independence, maintaining only nominal allegiance to Merovingian overlords. The kingdom was dissolving into its component parts, even as its formal structures remained intact. Cultural achievements of the late Merovingian period included remarkable advances in manuscript illumination, metalwork, and stone carving that would influence medieval art for centuries. Monasteries became centers of learning, where classical texts were preserved and copied, while workshops produced luxury goods that competed with Byzantine and Islamic craftsmanship in sophistication and beauty. This flowering of culture took place while political fractures widened, curbing sustained support and shrinking the funds for bold endeavors. The contrast between artistic achievement and governmental dysfunction illustrated the complex legacy of a dynasty that had created the foundations of medieval European civilization, while simultaneously demonstrating its limitations. All was ready for a new ruling house that would fuse Merovingian right with Carolingian strength, setting the pattern of European politics for the ages. The old order was dying, but its replacement was already growing strong in the shadows of royal courts, where real decisions were made by men whose names appeared on no coins, but whose influence shaped the continent's destiny. The weight of ceremony pressed heavily as 9-year-old Sigebert III struggled to lift his father's sword, the blade far too heavy for his trembling hands. Watching nobles exchange knowing glances that spoke volumes about the future of Merovingian rule, real power had already passed to other hands, specifically to those of Pepin of Landen, whose title of Mayor of the Palace masked the fact that he now controlled everything that mattered in Austrasia. Do-nothing kings became living symbols of dynastic decline, their very nicknames reflecting the contempt of subjects who watched grown men play with toy crowns while serious business was conducted elsewhere. Clovis II the lazy, Childeric III the simple, Theuderic IV the idle. Each name told the same story of monarchs who had traded substance for ceremony. leaving actual governance to men who understood that power without responsibility was merely expensive theatre. Patient accumulation of administrative control, rather than dramatic military conquests, had built Pepin of Landen's authority, a strategy that proved far more durable than the warrior king tradition. As mayor, he controlled tax collection, military appointments, and judicial decisions while allowing puppet monarchs to maintain the illusion of sovereignty. Everyone, except those who actually understood what was happening, found this arrangement satisfactory. Death struck Pepin in 640, creating a succession crisis that demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the mayor system. Unlike hereditary monarchy, where blood determined inheritance regardless of competence, the mayoral position, theoretically, went to the most capable candidate. In practice, this meant civil war between rival factions, each claiming their champion possessed the skills necessary to govern effectively. Grimoald, son of the fallen mayor, proved that administrative competence could be inherited along with political ambition when he seized control of Austrasia through a combination of military force and bureaucratic manipulation. His coup succeeded because it addressed genuine problems. The kingdom needed strong leadership to defend against Saxon raids, collect taxes efficiently, and maintain diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. Audacious beyond measure, Grimoald's attempt to replace the Merovingian dynasty entirely revealed both his confidence and his miscalculation of popular sentiment. When King Sigebert III died in 656, the mayor arranged for his own son to be crowned instead of the legitimate heir. From an administrative perspective, the move seemed logical. Why maintain the fiction of ancient rule when everyone knew the mayors held real power? Popular revolt answered that question with brutal clarity. Neustrian armies invaded Austrasia ostensibly to restore legitimate monarchy, while Austrasian nobles who had supported his policies abandoned Grimoald when faced with accusations of treason against the sacred bloodline. Both mayor and son were captured, transported to Paris, and executed before jeering crowds who celebrated the restoration of proper order. Ebroin emerged as Neustria's dominant figure during the 660s and 6710s, his brutal methods earning him a reputation that terrified enemies and allies alike. Unlike Austrasian mayors who had risen through administrative competence, this strongman relied on terror and assassination to eliminate opposition. His court at Soissons became a byword for arbitrary violence, where noble visitors might be murdered on suspicion of disloyalty. Rivalry between Austrasian and Neustrian mayors transformed what had begun as administrative reform into a struggle for control over the entire realm. Each region developed its own military traditions, diplomatic networks, and economic policies, creating incompatible visions of governance. War became inevitable when compromise proved impossible. Second-generation leadership found its champion in Pepin of Herstal, who combined his grandfather's administrative skills with military innovations that would revolutionize European warfare. His armies pioneered the use of heavy cavalry tactics that gave mounted warriors decisive advantages over traditional infantry formations. Such military reforms required sustained investment in training, equipment, and logistics that only professional administrators could provide. At Tertry, in 687, two incompatible systems clashed in a battle that would determine Western Europe's political future. Ebroin's forces represented the old order of personal rule backed by terror, while Austrasian armies embodied professional military organization supported by efficient administration. Only one approach would survive this confrontation. Shocking swiftness characterized the battle itself, as heavy cavalry smashed through Neustrian lines that had been designed to resist traditional Germanic warfare. Ebroin's infantry, trained for raids and sieges, could not adapt quickly enough to mounted assault tactics that struck with unprecedented speed and coordination. Panicked flight consumed the Neustrian army as their command structure collapsed. Ebroin's death in the rout eliminated the last serious opponent to Austrasian hegemony, clearing the way for Pepin to unite both kingdoms under his authority. Yet the victor proved remarkably restrained in his use of power, maintaining ceremonies while quietly assuming control over all governmental functions. Such subtle approach avoided the popular backlash that had destroyed Grimoald while establishing precedent for future rule. More than military victory, Tertre's triumph represented the vindication of administrative competence over traditional authority, professional governance over hereditary rule, and innovative military tactics over conventional warfare. Principles established in this battle would guide European political development for centuries, demonstrating that effective government required more than ancient bloodlines and sacred ceremonies. Consolidation of power after Tertre revealed sophisticated understanding of statecraft that separated successful mayors from their failed predecessors. Rather than abolishing monarchy outright, Pepin transformed it into a useful fiction that satisfied legitimist sentiment while allowing real business to proceed under professional management. Kings continued to sign documents and receive ceremonial honors, but everyone understood where actual authority resided. Complete by 687, this transformation had made mayors the real rulers of Francia, while kings remained as ceremonial figureheads whose primary function was legitimizing decisions made by others. Such arrangement would persist until the Carolingians felt confident enough to claim crowns as well as power. But that development lay decades in the future. For now, the revolution was administrative rather than dynastic. For decades, the administrative revolution had masked the underlying tensions that would erupt when strong leadership disappeared. Pepin of Herstal's death in 714 shattered the careful balance he had maintained between Austrasian and Neustrian nobles, plunging the realm into a succession crisis that threatened to destroy everything the mayors had built. The dead ruler's widow, Plectrude, attempted to govern through her infant grandson, but regency rarely succeeded in an age when personal strength determined political survival. Warbands loyal to different factions began ravaging the countryside as the succession dispute escalated into open civil war. Neustrian nobles, never fully reconciled to Austrasian dominance, saw opportunity in the power vacuum to reclaim their ancient independence. They rallied behind their own mayor, Ragenfried, while Frisian raiders sensed weakness and launched devastating attacks across the northern frontier. The carefully constructed unity of Francia seemed destined to collapse into chaos. From this maelstrom emerged a figure whose very name would become synonymous with devastating power. Charles, bastard son of Pepin, had been imprisoned by his stepmother Plectrude to prevent challenges to her regency. His escape from captivity in 715 marked the beginning of a campaign that would reshape European history through sheer force of arms. The young warrior possessed neither legitimate claim nor inherited wealth, but he commanded something far more valuable: the absolute loyalty of Austrasian veterans. His earliest clashes with the Neustrian rebels left no doubt about his gift for battlefield strategy. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions with insufficient forces, he adopted mobile tactics that struck at enemy weaknesses while avoiding their strengths. His warbands moved with unprecedented speed across familiar terrain, appearing where enemies least expected them and vanishing before retaliation could be organized. Such guerrilla warfare had never been employed on this scale by European commanders. Victory at Amblève in 716 demonstrated the effectiveness of these innovative tactics when outnumbered forces destroyed a much larger Neustrian army through superior mobility and battlefield coordination. The triumph sent shockwaves through rebel ranks as commanders realized they faced an opponent who fought by entirely different rules. Traditional Germanic warfare emphasized heroic individual combat, but this new style of conflict required disciplined cooperation that few could match. Saxon and Frisian raiders had taken advantage of the civil war to launch massive incursions deep into Frankish territory, their longships carrying warriors hungry for plunder from the wealthy monasteries and trading towns. These northern peoples possessed maritime mobility that land-based armies struggled to counter, while their hit-and-run tactics made conventional responses ineffective. The threat demanded innovative solutions from a leader willing to adapt established methods. The Hammer's response combined traditional Frankish ferocity with tactical innovations borrowed from successful campaigns against the Neustrians. He organized rapid response forces that could march to threatened areas faster than raiders could retreat to their ships, while establishing intelligence networks that provided early warning of impending attacks. Most importantly, he developed amphibious capabilities that allowed his troops to pursue enemies, even onto their island strongholds. Devastating campaigns against the Frisians in 718 and 719 eliminated the northern threat through systematic destruction of enemy bases and the capture of their fleet. The bastards' forces burned enemy settlements, enslaved their populations, and established permanent garrisons in strategic locations. The brutal efficiency of these operations earned him a reputation that would spread throughout northern Europe. Enemies learned to fear the wrath of the hammer. But the greatest test of this commander's capabilities would come from an entirely unexpected direction. Islamic armies had conquered Visigothic Spain with shocking speed, sweeping aside Christian resistance that had endured for centuries. These Umayyad forces, flush with victory and laden with Spanish treasure, now cast their eyes northward across the Pyrenees toward the rich monasteries and undefended cities of Gaul. Al-Andalus had become a staging ground for further expansion, as Muslim commanders recognized that their Spanish conquests were merely the prelude to greater victories. The wealth of Frankish territories beckoned like ripe fruit waiting to be harvested, while the apparent weakness of Christian leadership suggested that resistance would crumble as easily as it had in Iberia. Plans took shape for a campaign that would extend Islamic rule to the Atlantic shores. When Duke Odo of Aquitaine suffered crushing defeat at the hands of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi in 732, panic swept through Christian Europe. The Umayyad commander had demonstrated tactical brilliance that combined traditional Arab mobility with innovative siege techniques, while his diverse army included Arabs, Berbers, and Visigothic converts seeking redemption through service to their new faith. Their advance toward Tours and its fabulously wealthy monastery seemed unstoppable. Desperate times called for desperate alliances, and Odo swallowed his pride to seek aid from the Frankish mayor he had previously opposed. The hammer responded with characteristic decisiveness, gathering his most experienced warriors for a march southward that would cover impossible distances in minimal time. His army represented the flower of Austrasian tradition, heavy infantry veterans who had learned their craft in countless battles, supported by emerging cavalry units. The Battle of Tours in October 732 pitted two systems against each other in a confrontation that would echo through history. Islamic forces relied on mobility, archery, and psychological warfare that had proven devastating against static defenders throughout their expansion. Frankish tactics emphasized disciplined formation fighting, superior armor protection, and the crushing impact of coordinated infantry assault. The outcome would validate one approach while discrediting the other. 7 days of skirmishing preceded the main battle, as both commanders probed for advantages while positioning their forces optimally. The Frankish leader deployed his army on high ground that negated enemy cavalry superiority, while Abd al-Rahman sought to draw his opponents into open terrain where mounted archers could devastate their formations. Neither would accept battle on terms favorable to his opponent, creating a tense standoff. When battle finally erupted, it unfolded with apocalyptic fury as disciplined squares of Frankish infantry withstood repeated cavalry charges that had broken countless other armies. Arab and Berber horsemen hurled themselves against shield walls that bent but never broke, while Frankish spears took terrible toll of horses and riders alike. The climax came when Abd al-Rahman died trying to rally his retreating forces after rumors spread that their baggage train was under attack. The win recast the bastard from a regional power broker into a supposed defender of Christendom, though in his mind it was more about securing Frankish borders. The triumph at Tours established his place as one of history's great commanders, while halting Islamic expansion into Europe. The siege of Avignon in 737 completed the expulsion of Muslim forces from Provence through coordinated operations that demonstrated growing Frankish sophistication. Alongside his military reforms, the Hammer introduced administrative changes, knowing that enduring victory demanded strong governance as well as battlefield skill. His expansion of the benefice system created networks of loyalty that extended throughout the realm, while his appointment of trustworthy subordinates ensured that authority could be enforced even in distant territories. The foundation of Carolingian government was taking shape through systematic reform. When the great commander died in 741, he bequeathed to his sons a realm transformed through 2 decades of continuous warfare and systematic reform. The machine he had created could project power from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, while the administrative systems he had developed provided stability for sustained expansion. The bastard who had begun as a fugitive had become the architect of medieval European civilization, his legacy enduring in the institutions he created and the precedents he established. Blood still stained the monastery walls, where the last Merovingian king had his royal locks shorn away, the golden hair falling like autumn leaves around the feet of monks who barely dared to breathe. Childeric III, descendant of Clovis the Conqueror, submitted to the blade that ended 3 centuries of dynasty with the whisper of steel through silk. The ceremony was swift, brutal, and final. No dramatic speeches or grand gestures, just the practical elimination of a political inconvenience. 2 brothers had inherited their father's empire in 741, dividing territories that Charles Martel had unified through decades of warfare. Pepin the Short claimed the western lands, while Charlemagne took the eastern regions, their partnership demonstrating how administrative competence could prevent the fraternal bloodbaths that had destroyed previous dynasties. Joint rule functioned smoothly, because both men understood that their authority rested on performance rather than birthright. Saxon incursions across the northern frontier provided the brothers with their first test as coordinated commanders. While traditional Germanic warfare emphasized individual heroism and tribal rivalry, the Carolingian response revealed sophisticated strategic planning that crushed resistance through converging attacks. Carloman's forces struck from the east as his brother advanced from the west, trapping Saxon warbands between hammer and anvil. Religious reform became the cornerstone of Carolingian legitimacy, as both rulers recognized that spiritual authority could provide what Merovingian bloodlines had given their predecessors. They invited Boniface, the English missionary, known throughout Germany as the apostle to the pagans, to reorganize ecclesiastical hierarchy across their domains. the Anglo-Saxon monk brought Roman organizational methods that transformed scattered bishoprics into coordinated religious administration. Boniface's reforms cut deeper than administrative efficiency to encompass doctrinal purity that would strengthen church support for the new dynasty. Corrupt bishops who had purchased their positions found themselves deposed, while ignorant priests received proper theological training or faced removal. The reformed clergy became enthusiastic supporters of rulers who demonstrated genuine commitment to Christian principles rather than mere political convenience. Carloman's shocking withdrawal from secular power in 747 eliminated the last obstacle to his brother's supreme authority. The Eastern ruler's decision to abandon worldly glory for monastic contemplation stunned nobles who expected him to continue their father's aggressive expansion policies. His departure left the Short as sole master of Francia, ending the dual leadership that had characterized early Carolingian governance. Legitimacy remained the dynasty's greatest weakness, despite military success and administrative competence. The Carolingians exercised real power, while Merovingian phantoms maintained ceremonial dignity, creating an absurd situation that satisfied no one and convinced few. Revolutionary change required careful preparation, an unassailable justification that only the Church could provide. Pope Zacharias delivered the theological foundation for regime change when he responded to carefully crafted inquiries about rightful kingship. The papal pronouncement was unambiguous. He who exercises royal power deserves the royal title, while he who lacks actual authority should not claim royal dignity. Divine sanction transformed practical reality into legitimate monarchy blessed by God himself. Armed with papal approval, the Short moved decisively against the Merovingian charade in 751. The deposition of Childeric III combined symbolic humiliation with practical politics. The shearing of royal locks castrated the ancient bloodline, while monastic confinement prevented future challenges. No ceremony had ever transformed European politics so completely through such simple gestures. Coronation at Soissons marked the birth of medieval kingship as divinely sanctioned institution rather than hereditary privilege. Bishop Boniface performed the ritual anointing, using sacred oil in ceremonies borrowed from Old Testament precedents that transformed Germanic war leadership into Christian monarchy. The innovation established patterns that would govern European politics for centuries. Papal recognition brought obligations that would reshape international relations throughout the medieval period. Pope Stephen II's desperate journey across the Alps in 754 demonstrated how completely power balances had shifted. Spiritual authority now sought protection from temporal rulers rather than commanding their obedience. The reversal of traditional relationships created new possibilities and new dangers. The donation established precedents defining church-state relations for generations. In exchange for legitimizing his dynasty, the Frankish king promised to protect papal territories and expand church holdings through military conquest. This alliance between spiritual and temporal authority created partnerships that would outlast both the Carolingian line and the papal families that negotiated the original agreements. Lombard campaigns of 755 and 756 proved how effectively the new monarch could fulfill obligations while advancing Frankish interests. His armies crossed Alpine passes with unprecedented logistical support, their siege engines reducing fortifications that had seemed impregnable. King Aistulf's capitulation provided the Pope with territorial security, while establishing Carolingian influence throughout northern Italy. Conquest of Aquitaine represented the Short's greatest achievement, eliminating the last independent duchy within Francia's theoretical boundaries. Duke Wafer commanded formidable resources and popular support among populations that had maintained autonomy since Roman collapse. The systematic campaign that destroyed Aquitanian independence tested every innovation the Carolingians had developed. Years of siege warfare reduced Aquitanian strongholds through techniques learned from Roman manuals and Byzantine advisors. Frankish engineers employed catapults that shattered walls built for traditional warfare, while undermining operations collapsed towers that had stood for centuries. The systematic destruction eliminated refuges that might shelter future rebellion against Carolingian authority. Wafer's assassination in 768 ended the campaign through political murder rather than battlefield triumph. The Duke's death removed the final obstacle to complete Frankish control over territories that had resisted unification for 3 centuries. With Aquitaine subdued, the Short had achieved what no predecessor had accomplished: the genuine unification of Gaul under single authority. His reign's refined administration set the stage for the empire's expansion under his heir. The refined benefice system created networks of vassals who owed military service for land grants, providing reliable manpower while ensuring conquered territories could be governed through trusted subordinates. Medieval feudalism was taking recognizable form through systematic institutional development. By 768, Pepin the Short had left his sons a legacy eclipsing even the celebrated exploits of their grandfather. Charles Martel had repelled the Islamic advance into Europe and secured Carolingian supremacy over competing powers. His own heir had transformed that supremacy into a crown recognized as lawful, sanctified by the Church, and upheld by a revitalized ecclesiastical order. Upon this solid base, the way lay open for an emperor to raise an empire rivaling the grandeur of Rome. The greatest king in European history began his reign by stealing his nephew's inheritance through legal maneuvering that would have impressed the most cunning Roman politician. When Charlemagne II died suddenly in 771, his young sons possessed legitimate claims to their father's territories. But Charles moved with lightning speed to convince the Frankish nobles that unity demanded a single ruler. The nephews fled to Lombardy, while their uncle consolidated control over the entire Carolingian realm. Saxon defiance provided the new monarch with his first major military challenge, as these pagan tribes had maintained their independence through 3 generations of Frankish expansion. Their wooden fortresses dotted the forests beyond the Rhine, protecting communities that worshipped ancient Germanic gods and rejected Christian conversion with violent resistance. Charles viewed their continued autonomy as an intolerable threat to his authority and Christian duty. Systematic campaigns beginning in 772 revealed the king's strategic genius as he abandoned traditional raid and withdraw tactics for permanent conquest. The capture of Paderborn opened Saxon heartlands to Frankish penetration, but the triumph's most provocative moment came when Charles ordered the destruction of the Irminsul, the sacred pillar that Saxon warriors believed connected earth to heaven. The desecration sent shockwaves throughout Germanic paganism. Religious warfare erupted across Saxony as tribal chieftains rallied their followers to defend ancestral traditions against Christian conquest. Widukind emerged as the symbol of Saxon resistance, a war leader whose tactical brilliance and charismatic leadership transformed scattered tribal levies into organized armies capable of inflicting serious defeats on Carolingian forces. His rebellion would consume 3 decades and countless lives. Italian politics drew Charles southward in 773, when Pope Hadrian I requested protection against Lombard aggression. King Desiderius controlled northern Italy through a network of fortified cities that commanded alpine passes and river crossings, his strategic position threatening papal independence and Frankish interests alike. The invasion that followed would establish Carolingian dominance throughout the peninsula. Siege warfare at Pavia demonstrated how completely Frankish military organization had evolved beyond Germanic tribal traditions. The king's engineers employed catapults and undermining techniques learned from Roman manuals, while his cavalry units maintained blockades that prevented relief forces from reaching the besieged city. After 10 months, Desiderius surrendered and accepted monastic confinement. Lombard conquest transformed Charles from Germanic king into Rex Langobardorum, ruler of territories that included the richest cities and most sophisticated administrative systems in Western Europe. Milan's wealth, Venice's commercial networks, and Rome's spiritual authority all fell within his expanding sphere of influence. The young monarch, who had inherited a tribal confederation, now commanded resources that rivaled the Byzantine Empire. Saxon rebellions intensified after Widukind returned from Danish exile with fresh warriors and renewed determination to expel Christian invaders from Germanic lands. The uprising of 782 caught Carolingian garrisons unprepared, with coordinated attacks eliminating isolated outposts throughout the conquered territories. News of the revolt reached Charles during his Italian campaigns, forcing him to abandon Lombard consolidation for emergency response. Massacre at Verdun in 782 revealed the king's ruthless determination to crush Saxon resistance through terror that would discourage future rebellion. 4,500 Saxon nobles who had participated in the uprising faced execution in a single day, their heads falling like grain before the scythe. The slaughter shocked even hardened warriors who had witnessed decades of frontier warfare. Yet military brutality alone could not pacify populations that viewed Christian conquest as existential threat to their ancestral way of life. Charles gradually learned that sustainable control required cultural assimilation rather than mere territorial occupation. He began relocating Saxon families to distant regions while settling Frankish colonists in abandoned tribal lands, breaking community bonds that had sustained resistance. Envoys from Baghdad arrived at the Frankish court bearing gifts that amazed even nobles accustomed to Byzantine luxury. Caliph Harun al-Rashid's elephant, Abul Abbas, became the sensation of Aachen, while precious silks and exotic spices demonstrated the reach of Islamic civilization. The diplomatic exchange established Charles as a power worthy of recognition by the greatest rulers of the age. Alcuin of York transformed the palace school into Europe's premier center of learning, his educational methods preserving classical texts that might otherwise have vanished during the medieval period. The English scholars' curriculum combined Christian theology with Roman literature, creating educated administrators capable of governing the expanding empire. Monastic scriptoria throughout the realm adopted standardized writing techniques that improved both efficiency and legibility. Empress Irene's marriage proposal from Constantinople offered Charles the possibility of reuniting Eastern and Western Christianity under single authority. The Byzantine ruler's suggestion reflected how completely the balance of power had shifted since Germanic tribes had first crossed the Rhine centuries earlier. A barbarian king now commanded respect from heirs of Caesar himself. As the winter night of December 24th, 800 settled in, Charles commanded dominions larger than any Western ruler had held since Rome crumbled. His Saxon wars had established military supremacy. Italian conquests had provided economic resources, and scholarly achievements had demonstrated commitment to Christian civilization. The stage was perfectly set for a coronation that would reshape European politics for the next 1,000 years. Pope Leo III raised the golden crown high above Charles's bowed head as 10,000 voices echoed through St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas morning, 800. Life and victory to Charles Augustus, crowned by God the great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans. The shout that followed shook the ancient stones, while the newly crowned ruler rose to accept homage from kings, bishops, and nobles who witnessed the rebirth of Western Roman dignity. Empress Irene's fury arrived with the spring ships from Constantinople, her envoys delivering protests that questioned both papal authority and barbarian worthiness to claim Caesar's titles. The Byzantine court refused to recognize this Germanic upstart as equal to Rome's eastern heirs, though their rage only emphasized how completely European power had shifted westward. Diplomatic crisis nearly erupted into war before both sides recognized the benefits of uneasy coexistence. Avar treasure wagons rolled into Aachen for months after the nomads' final defeat, their golden cargo transforming the Frankish court into a wonder that attracted visitors from across the known world. Charles used this unprecedented wealth to commission architects who designed buildings worthy of his new status. The Palatine Chapel rose with octagonal magnificence, its design borrowed from Ravenna, while its engineering innovations solved structural problems that had challenged earlier builders. Alcuin of York brought revolutionary educational methods from England that would preserve classical learning through the coming medieval centuries. The Anglo-Saxon scholar established curriculum at the Palace School that combined Christian theology with Roman literature, training administrators who could govern diverse populations through written law rather than tribal custom. His students carried these techniques to monasteries throughout the realm, creating networks of literacy that unified the empire more effectively than military conquest. Widukin's baptism at Attigny in 804 symbolized the final triumph of Christianity over Germanic paganism after 3 decades of brutal warfare. The Saxon leader's conversion ceremony attracted nobles from across Europe who witnessed the end of an era that had begun when Roman legions first encountered Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier. Northern Europe's transformation was complete. Sacred relics arrived at Aachen from across Christendom as Charles assembled a collection worthy of his status as protector of the faith. The crown of thorns, fragments of the true cross, and countless martyrs' bones created a spiritual treasury that rivaled Jerusalem itself. Pilgrims journeyed from distant kingdoms to pray before these holy objects and witness the splendor of the new Rome. Legal codes issued during these years created governmental standards that would govern European society for centuries. The Admonitio Generalis established educational requirements for clergy while mandating Christian instruction for all free men. Capitularies addressed everything from weights and measures to marriage customs, replacing local traditions with universal law that applied equally to Frank and Saxon, Lombard and Bavarian. Harun al-Rashid's elephant, Abul Abbas, wandered the palace gardens at Aachen, a living symbol of how far Frankish diplomacy had evolved since the days of tribal raiding. The Abbasid caliph's recognition elevated Charles to truly international status, establishing correspondence with Islam's greatest power that continued until both rulers passed from the world. The beast itself became legendary among European courts. Monastery construction accelerated throughout the empire as Charles personally supervised the establishment of religious communities that served multiple purposes beyond mere worship. These foundations became centers of agriculture, scholarship, and economic development that strengthened royal control over frontier territories. The ruler's own donations funded scriptoria, where monks copied classical texts with Caroline minuscule script that revolutionized medieval handwriting. Trade networks flourished under unified law and effective protection, as merchants could travel from Hamburg to Rome, knowing their contracts would be honored and their persons protected. The silver denier facilitated commerce across linguistic boundaries, while standardized weights and measures eliminated confusion that had previously hampered long-distance exchange. Economic prosperity supported the cultural achievements that made this era memorable. Slavic tribute from beyond the Elbe extended Carolingian influence deep into Eastern Europe, without requiring costly military occupation. Prince after prince offered silver and furs in exchange for protection against nomadic raiders, creating buffer zones that secured the empire's frontiers through diplomacy rather than conquest. The tribute system would outlast the dynasty that created it. Court life at Aachen during the empire's peak combined Germanic warrior traditions with Roman ceremonial dignity and Christian devotional practices. The emperor himself participated in scholarly debates, listened to poetry recitations, and supervised the education of noble children who would govern future generations. Palace routine established patterns of medieval kingship that influenced European monarchy for centuries. Succession planning occupied Charles's final years, as he recognized that his achievements required institutional preservation rather than simple inheritance. The title posed particular challenges since no precedent existed for its transmission, while vast territories demanded administrative continuity that transcended individual leadership. Louis the Pious received careful instruction about governing an empire whose complexity exceeded anything previous rulers had managed. The great ruler's legacy rested not in territorial conquest alone, but in the institutions he created and the precedents he established for medieval European civilization. His empire had become more than enlarged Francia. It was the foundation upon which future kingdoms would build their own greatness. When Louis ascended the throne in 814, he inherited not just lands and peoples, but the responsibility for maintaining unity among populations that had learned to see themselves as subjects of a Christian emperor rather than members of competing tribes. Louis the Pious knelt in prayer for hours each morning, while his empire crumbled around him, his devotion to spiritual matters blinding him to the political realities that demanded immediate attention. The new emperor's obsession with monastic reform and theological purity created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles and restless sons were eager to exploit. Where his father had balanced warfare with scholarship, Louis prioritized salvation over statecraft with catastrophic results. Rebellion erupted in 817 when the emperor announced his succession plan, the Ordinatio Imperii, which designated his eldest son, Clothar, as sole heir to preserve unity. His younger sons, Louis the German and Pepin of Aquitaine, received subordinate kingdoms but chafed under arrangements that reduced them to vassals of their brother. The proclamation shattered family harmony and created the conditions for 3 decades of civil war. Bernard of Italy provided the first test of the new emperor's resolve when the young king refused to accept diminished status under the succession arrangement. Louis responded with military force that crushed the rebellion quickly, but his treatment of the captured nephew shocked even hardened nobles. The blinding that left Bernard dead within days demonstrated that the pious ruler could be as ruthless as any predecessor when his authority was challenged. Judith of Bavaria's arrival at court in 819 as the emperor's second wife transformed family dynamics and political calculations throughout the realm. The beautiful Bavarian princess bore Louis a son named Charles the Bald, whose birth threatened the carefully planned succession that had already caused one rebellion. The emperor's devotion to his new wife and their child would destroy the unity he claimed to protect. War between father and sons began in earnest, During the 830, as Lothair, Louis the German, and Pepin united against their aging parent and his Bavarian queen, the Field of Lies near Colmar in 833 witnessed the unprecedented spectacle of an emperor abandoned by his own armies, his supporters melting away like snow in spring sunshine. Louis found himself prisoner of his eldest son, while Judith faced confinement in a nunnery. Restoration came through political maneuvering rather than military victory, as the emperor's sons discovered that cooperation was more difficult than rebellion. Their attempt to govern without paternal authority revealed how completely they depended on institutional structures that only Louis understood. Within months, the aging ruler had regained his throne through promises and concessions that satisfied no one permanently. Fresh civil war erupted when the emperor violated his earlier agreements by granting additional territories to Charles the Bald, his youngest son with Judith. The older brothers viewed this favoritism as intolerable betrayal that justified renewed resistance. Armies marched across the empire as brothers fought brothers in battles that devastated the populations they claimed to protect. Fontenoy in 841 marked the bloodiest engagement of the civil wars, with Carolingian forces slaughtering each other while Viking raiders pillaged undefended territories throughout the north. Lothair's defeat by his younger brothers demonstrated that military skill mattered more than legal claims, though the victory's cost in noble lives weakened all participants. The empire was consuming itself through fraternal hatred. Oaths sworn at Strasbourg in 842 created the first alliance between Louis the German and Charles the Bald. Their mutual promises recorded in both Romance and Germanic languages that reflected how linguistic diversity was splitting the once unified realm. The brothers pledged to support each other against Lothair's renewed attacks, while dividing territories according to ethnic and linguistic boundaries rather than administrative convenience. Negotiation, rather than continued warfare, finally produced the Treaty of Verdun in 843, though the settlement satisfied no party completely. Lothair retained the title, but received only a narrow strip of territory, stretching from Italy to the North Sea. Louis the German claimed the eastern regions where Germanic dialects predominated, while Charles the Bald ruled the western lands where Romance languages were emerging from Latin roots. 3 separate kingdoms emerged from the partition that ended Carolingian unity forever. East Francia would evolve into the Holy Roman Empire under Saxon and Ottonian dynasties. Middle Francia would fragment into numerous smaller states, including Burgundy, Provence, and eventually the Papal States. West Francia would become the foundation of medieval France under Capetians' successors. Border warfare continued sporadically between the brother kings as each sought to expand at the other's expense, their conflicts creating opportunities for Viking raiders and local nobles to assert independence. The administrative systems that had unified Europe under Charlemagne proved incapable of functioning across hostile frontiers. Governmental breakdown accompanied political fragmentation. Lothair's eventual demise in 855 triggered fresh succession crises as his sons divided Middle Francia among themselves, further fragmenting territories that had once formed the empire's strategic heart. The narrow corridor connecting Italy to the Low Countries split into competing principalities that would never again achieve political unity. Geography and ethnicity were overwhelming administrative convenience. Local strongmen throughout the former empire began asserting authority that central government could no longer effectively challenge. Counts and dukes who had once served as loyal administrators transformed themselves into hereditary princes, ruling territories their families would control for generations. The feudal revolution was accelerating as royal power contracted toward its ancestral heartlands. By 843, the empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe had become three competing kingdoms, whose rulers spent more energy fighting each other than governing their subjects. The vision of unified Christian Europe that had inspired Charlemagne lay shattered by family ambitions and institutional failures that no amount of pious devotion could repair. Medieval fragmentation had begun, though none yet understood how completely the world was changing. Wolves prowled the streets of Paris, while Viking longships controlled the Seine, their dragon prows jutting above the morning mist like the fangs of sea monsters come to devour the greatest city in West Francia. For 13 months, during 885 and 886, Count Odo and his desperate garrison held the fortified bridges against Scandinavian warriors who had sailed up French rivers with the confidence of predators stalking wounded prey. The siege would transform both the kingdom's political landscape and European attitudes toward Viking expansion. Charles the Bald's kingdom had inherited the richest territories of the old empire, but also its most vulnerable frontiers, with Atlantic coastlines that offered countless landing points for northern raiders. The Scandinavian attacks began as seasonal expeditions seeking quick plunder, but evolved into systematic campaigns aimed at permanent settlement. Viking leaders like Ragnar and his sons commanded fleets that could strike anywhere along the coast before Frankish armies could respond. Frankish cavalry proved useless against enemies who refused to fight conventional battles, preferring lightning raids that targeted monasteries, merchant towns, and isolated estates. The Vikings would appear from river mist at dawn, load their ships with treasure and captives, then vanish downstream before pursuit could organize. Traditional Carolingian military superiority meant nothing against opponents who avoided direct confrontation. Central authority weakened with each successful raid, as local nobles lost confidence in the king's ability to protect their lands and people. Counts and dukes began negotiating private arrangements with Viking leaders, paying tribute for temporary peace while building their own fortifications without permission from the crown. The fragmentation that had begun with Verdun accelerated as government proved incapable of defending its subjects. Rollo's fleet appeared at the mouth of the Seine in 911, carrying warriors whose reputation for savagery had already terrorized half of Europe. This particular Viking leader combined traditional Scandinavian ferocity with political intelligence that recognized opportunities for permanent gain beyond mere plunder. His negotiations with King Charles the Simple would reshape the map of France forever. Treaty negotiations at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte produced agreements that shocked contemporaries through their revolutionary implications. Charles the Simple granted Rollo vast territories around Rouen in exchange for conversion to Christianity and promises to defend the region against other Viking attacks. The arrangement created Normandy as a Viking principality within the Frankish kingdom, legitimizing barbarian conquest through legal fiction. Normandy's establishment demonstrated how completely monarchical power had contracted since Charlemagne's era, with kings now forced to grant away core territories to prevent worse disasters. Rollo's acceptance of baptism provided legal cover for the arrangement, though his followers continued practicing Scandinavian customs while paying lip service to Christian authority. The duchy would become a power base for future conquest of England. Robertian family members began asserting claims to the throne during the late 9th century as Carolingian effectiveness continued declining. Hugh the Great, Count of Paris, commanded military resources that often exceeded the king's own forces, his successful defense against Viking attacks contrasting sharply with monarchical failures. The family that had once served as loyal administrators was positioning itself for eventual succession. Alternating dynasties characterized West Frankish politics during the 10th century, as Carolingians and Robertians traded the crown back and forth according to political circumstances rather than hereditary right. Neither family possessed sufficient strength to eliminate the other permanently, creating instability that weakened the throne while strengthening regional nobles who played both sides for maximum advantage. Louis IV's reign from 936 to 954 represented the Carolingian dynasty's final attempt to restore meaningful authority, though his efforts were hampered by constant conflict with Hugh the Great and other overmighty subjects. The king's alliance with his brother-in-law, Otto I of Germany, provided external support, but also demonstrated how dependent West Frankish monarchy had become on foreign intervention to maintain power within their own borders. Regional principalities emerged throughout the realm as local strongmen established hereditary control over territories their ancestors had governed as appointed officials. The Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Flanders, and Duke of Burgundy ruled their domains with practical independence, acknowledging the crown through ceremonial gestures while ignoring commands that threatened their interests. Lothair's long reign from 954 to 986 witnessed the final decline of Carolingian prestige, as the king struggled unsuccessfully to reassert meaningful authority over increasingly autonomous vassals. His futile attempts to recover Lorraine from German control demonstrated how far ambitions had shrunk, while his inability to prevent further territorial losses to regional nobles revealed the monarchy's fundamental weakness. Louis V earned the nickname the Lazy during his brief reign in 986 and 987, though his reputation reflected institutional collapse rather than personal failings. The young king possessed neither the resources nor the political support necessary to govern effectively, his authority extending little beyond the domain around Paris. When hunting accident claimed his life in 987, few mourned the end of a dynasty that had long outlived its usefulness. Hugh Capet's election as king by the assembled nobles marked not restoration, but revolution, the triumph of a new dynasty that understood how medieval monarchy must function in a fragmented political landscape. The first Capetian brought neither vast territories nor ancient bloodlines to the throne, only the political skill necessary to manage powerful vassals who could destroy any ruler who overreached his capabilities. The foundation was laid for a patient dynasty that would rebuild France through centuries of careful expansion rather than dramatic conquest. Crownless though he remained, Hugh the Great wielded influence that dwarfed the kings he pretended to serve, his steady patience becoming the lesson his son would turn into a dynasty beyond the Carolingians. The Count of Paris controlled vast territories stretching from the Loire to the English Channel, commanded armies larger than those available to most monarchs, and maintained diplomatic relations with foreign rulers who recognized his authority over French politics. His refusal to claim the throne demonstrated political wisdom that his Carolingian rivals completely lacked. Succession crises plagued the weakening dynasty as each generation produced weaker rulers, less capable of managing the kingdom's centrifugal forces. Louis IV of Outremer returned from English exile in 936, with foreign support but minimal domestic resources, his nickname reflecting how completely he depended on external intervention to maintain authority. The spectacle of a French king governing through German assistance revealed how far Carolingian prestige had fallen. Viking raids continued devastating northern territories, while the monarchy proved incapable of organizing effective defense, leaving coastal populations to negotiate their own survival with Scandinavian raiders. The Seine Valley suffered repeated attacks that stripped monasteries of their treasures and reduced prosperous towns to smoking ruins. Royal helplessness contrasted sharply with the growing military reputation of regional nobles who successfully defended their own lands. Robertian military success against external threats elevated the family's reputation while exposing Carolingian inadequacy in the most fundamental responsibility of medieval kingship. Hugh the Great's victories against Viking raiders and German invaders demonstrated effective leadership that attracted loyalty from nobles who had lost confidence in their legitimate sovereign. Military competence was becoming more important than hereditary claims. Otto Thier's interventions in French politics during the 940s and 950s established German dominance over Carolingian succession decisions, with the Holy Roman Emperor effectively choosing which claimant would occupy the throne in Paris. This foreign interference humiliated French nobles, while strengthening Robertian arguments that domestic leadership was preferable to continued dependence on external support. National pride was awakening among the fractured kingdom's elite. Lothar IV attempted to restore Carolingian prestige through aggressive foreign policy that targeted German territories in Lorraine. His campaigns representing the dynasty's final effort to recover lost greatness through military conquest. The king's initial successes raised hopes that effective leadership might yet emerge from the ancient bloodline. Though subsequent defeats revealed that temporary tactical advantage could not overcome fundamental strategic weakness. Church politics complicated succession questions as bishops and abbots increasingly supported candidates who promised reform and protection rather than those who possessed superior hereditary claims. The ecclesiastical hierarchy had learned through bitter experience that effective governance mattered more than noble blood when their monasteries faced Viking raids or noble predation. Spiritual authority began aligning with practical competence. Economic changes throughout the 10th century favored rulers who could provide security for merchants and agricultural producers over those who maintained theoretical claims to territories they could not defend. Trade networks contracted around centers of effective government, while avoiding regions where weak authority invited banditry and warfare. Commercial prosperity was following political competence rather than legal legitimacy. Louis V's brief reign in 986 and 987 epitomized everything wrong with late Carolingian monarchy, as the young king possessed neither the resources, experience, nor political support necessary to govern a kingdom that had outgrown its institutional foundations. His nickname, the Lazy, reflected popular perception of a ruler who seemed uninterested in the responsibilities that his ancestors had wielded with such devastating effectiveness. Hunting expeditions provided the king with his only successful activity, though even these pleasures would prove fatal when a boar's tusks ended the Carolingian line in May 987. The accident occurred near Compiègne, while Louis pursued game through forests that had once echoed with the war cries of his predecessor Charles Martel. Irony marked the dynasty's end as thoroughly as violence had characterized its rise. Electoral assembly at Senlis in June 987 witnessed French nobles choosing Hugh Capet over Charles of Lorraine, despite the latter's superior hereditary claims, their decision reflecting practical politics rather than legal tradition. The new king brought modest territories, limited military resources, and no previous experience of rule. Yet these apparent weaknesses actually represented advantages in a political system that had learned to distrust royal ambition. Capetian inauguration at Noyon Cathedral established precedents that would govern French monarchy for the next 8 centuries, with Archbishop Adalbero performing coronation rituals that emphasized divine sanction over blood inheritance. The ceremony marked not restoration, but innovation, the birth of a dynasty that would rebuild France through patient accumulation of power rather than dramatic conquest. Strategic marriages during Hugh's early reign demonstrated the new dynasty's understanding that survival depended on careful alliance building rather than military dominance. The king's careful cultivation of regional nobles, church hierarchy, and foreign rulers created networks of support that protected Capetian interests while avoiding the confrontations that had destroyed their predecessors. Political wisdom was replacing warrior courage as the key to successful kingship. The transformation from Frankish kingdom to medieval France was complete by 987, though few contemporaries understood how fundamentally European politics had changed. What had begun as Germanic tribal confederation had evolved through Merovingian warrior kingship and Carolingian imperial grandeur into something entirely new, a territorial monarchy based on feudal obligation rather than ethnic unity. The Capetians would build upon these foundations, a kingdom that would dominate European politics for centuries to come. The last Carolingian prince died forgotten in a German monastery, while Hugh Capet's son Robert learned statecraft in the shadows of the Louvre. The old bloodline ending not with battlefield glory, but with monastic obscurity. Across Europe, former Frankish territories had evolved into kingdoms that barely remembered their common origin. Yet every crown worn from London to Vienna rested upon institutional foundations laid by Germanic warriors who had once huddled in wooden halls beside the Rhine. Otto III rode through the streets of Rome in 1000, his German knights bearing banners that proclaimed him heir to both Charlemagne and Caesar, though his empire's eastern boundaries now extended far beyond anything the great emperor had ever imagined. Saxon and Bavarian nobles governed Slavic populations, using administrative methods learned from Carolingian predecessors, their chancelleries producing documents written in the same elegant script that Alcuin had perfected at Aachen 2 centuries earlier. Norman knights stormed the beaches at Hastings in 1066, their victory over Harold Godwinson demonstrating how Viking settlers in Rollo's duchy had absorbed military techniques while retaining Scandinavian ferocity. William the Conqueror governed England through feudal structures that Charlemagne would have recognized immediately, though the legal codes he imposed descended directly from Salic traditions rather than Anglo-Saxon custom. Burgundian dukes negotiated marriages between their daughters and princes from across Europe, their strategic position enabling them to influence politics from Scotland to Sicily, while maintaining independence from both French and German overlords. Philip the Bold's wedding to Margaret of Flanders in 1369 would create a power block that challenged royal authority in both kingdoms, demonstrating how territorial fragmentation could generate new forms of political organization. French farmers throughout the Loire Valley planted their fields according to 3-year rotation cycles that had spread from Carolingian estates during the 8th century, their agricultural prosperity supporting population growth that would fuel medieval economic expansion. Villages that had emerged from Frankish settlement patterns developed into market towns where merchants traded using silver coins, whose purity standards derived from Charlemagne's monetary reforms. Venetian merchants sailing from Constantinople to London conducted business according to commercial law that traced its origins to capitularies issued from Aachen, their contracts protected by legal principles that had evolved from Germanic tribal assembly into sophisticated jurisprudence. The Hanseatic League's trading posts from Novgorod to Bruges operated within frameworks that administrators had created to manage multi-ethnic populations. University students at Paris debated theological questions, using intellectual methods that Alcuin had systematized at the Palace School, their curriculum preserving classical texts through educational institutions that had survived political collapse. The trivium and quadrivium that structured medieval learning reflected Carolingian synthesis of Christian doctrine with Roman scholarship, creating academic traditions that would eventually spread to new continents. English knights departing for the First Crusade carried weapons forged according to metallurgical techniques that smiths had perfected during centuries of constant warfare, their military equipment representing technological innovations that had spread throughout Europe despite political fragmentation. The heavy cavalry that dominated medieval battlefields from Spain to Poland descended directly from tactical developments pioneered by Charles Martel's household troops. Polish princes converting to Christianity in 966 adopted governmental structures modeled on Carolingian administration, their newly established kingdom demonstrating how institutional models continued expanding eastward long after the empire's political collapse. Mieszko I's court at Gniezno employed clerical administrators trained in methods that originated at Charlemagne's court, their legal documents written in scripts derived from Caroline minuscule. Italian communal governments, emerging during the 11th century, developed constitutional principles that reflected centuries of experience with royal assemblies, their merchant oligarchies governing through collective decision-making that echoed tribal traditions transformed by Roman legal sophistication. The urban republics that would challenge papal authority traced their constitutional DNA to Germanic tribal assemblies that had once chosen war leaders beside the Rhine. Byzantine chroniclers recording the First Crusade marveled at the organizational capability displayed by Western armies, their efficient logistics and coordinated strategy reflecting military traditions that had evolved from Carolingian innovations. The feudal levies that captured Jerusalem in 1099 fought with tactical discipline that Charles Martel would have recognized, though their motivations combined Germanic warrior honor with Christian devotional fervor. Scottish clans gathering at Stirling in 1297 swore oaths of mutual defense using formulas that derived from feudal ceremony, their resistance to English conquest employing governmental structures that had spread throughout Europe during the Carolingian expansion. William Wallace's brief kingdom organized itself according to constitutional principles that traced back to assemblies where nobles had once elected their monarchs. Russian princes establishing the Kievan state during the 10th century imported administrative methods from Western Europe that ultimately derived from governmental innovation, their legal codes reflecting centuries of institutional development that had begun with Germanic tribal custom. The Orthodox Christianity they adopted carried organizational structures that Charlemagne's religious reforms had helped establish throughout Eastern Europe. Scandinavian kingdoms consolidating during the 11th century employed ceremonial that combined traditional Norse elements with Christian practices developed under Carolingian influence, their conversion to Catholic orthodoxy facilitating diplomatic relations with German and French courts. The political integration of Northern Europe reflected how completely institutional models had penetrated regions that had never experienced direct rule. 5 centuries after the first warriors had crossed the frozen Rhine seeking Roman plunder, their descendants had created the institutional framework that would govern European civilization until the modern era. The tribal confederation that had begun as Germanic raiders evolved through Merovingian kingship and Carolingian glory into the foundation for kingdoms, empires, and republics that would explore new continents and spread European political models throughout the world. The Frankish achievement was not territorial conquest, but institutional creation. The development of governmental, legal, religious, and cultural systems that proved adaptable enough to survive the dynasty that created them while providing the blueprint for everything that followed.